Why is it that Washington always jumps blindly into culture war fighting? Why is it that we first divide into blue shirts versus red shirts, retreat into our tribes, and then try to figure out how we can inflict maximum damage on each other? That's not how adults in the communities across our country solve their problems, and that's not how they'd like us to be solving our problems. But that's actually what's happening right now in this body. The legislation before the Senate is supposed to be about national security, which is the first and the most important duty of the federal government. Republican and Democrat, all 100 members of this body, tell ourselves and tell our constituents that we love and want to support and provide for the troops. And I want that to be true, and I think that that is true. And thus, I think we should be able to agree that national security is far more important than trying to run up partisan scores in another culture war battle. And by the way, culture war battles are almost never settled well by compulsion and by government and by force. But here we are, getting ready to divide again, this time over the issue of women in the draft. And I want to ask why. Let me ask a question that should be obvious. Why are we now fighting about drafting our sisters and our mothers and our daughters into a draft that no one anywhere is telling us that they need? Seriously, where is there any general who's appeared before us and said that the most pressing issue, or even a pressing issue, about our national security challenges and efforts at the present time is that we don't have enough people to draft? Where has that happened? Who has said it? Because I've been listening and I haven't heard a single person from the national security community come before us and say, you know what we need? We need more people in the draft. I haven't heard that conversation anywhere. This fight about women in the draft is entirely unnecessary. And wisdom should be nudging us to try to avoid unnecessary fighting. We have enough big, real, and important fighting we should be doing around here. Why would we take on unnecessary fighting? So before we send out our press releases and before we decide to condemn people that are on the other side of a culture war battle from us, why don't we just pause and together agree on this one indisputable fact? We have the best fighting force that the world has ever known, and it is an all-volunteer force, in fact, right now. We're not drafting anybody. And no one is recommending that we draft anybody. So why are we having this fight? Rather than needlessly dividing the American people over a 20th century registration process, why wouldn't we do this? Why wouldn't we pause, stop the expansion of the draft, stop to study the purposes of the draft, and actually evaluate whether or not we really need a draft? Maybe we do. But let's actually evaluate it before we start fighting over the most controversial pieces of it. So let's not start by fighting about who to add to the draft. Let's not start by trying to import culture warring into a national security bill. Let's start by asking if we're really certain we need the draft. So I'm introducing a simple amendment. And I hope that this body could agree that its aim is common sense and its aim is to de-escalate our bitter conflicts. My simple amendment would replace the NDAA's controversial draft provisions with 3 relatively non-controversial and I think much more important steps. Number 1, my amendment would ask the Senate to admit that the draft, which last had a call, by the way, the last call of the draft was in December of 1972. I was 10 months old, and I think I'm 5 years older than the youngest member of this body. The last time there was a call in the draft was December of 1972. We should admit that it's probably time for a reevaluation instead of just a continuing on autopilot. Number 2, it would sunset the draft 3 years from now unless this body decides that we've consulted the generals and we can tell the American people that we need the draft to continue. So the second thing it does, it sunsets the draft 3 years in the future unless we would act to restore the draft. And third, it requires the Secretary of Defense to report back to this body, to report back to the Congress in 6 months on the merits of the selective service system rather than simply continuing it on status quo, autopilot, unscrutinized. Again, this isn't asking the Secretary of Defense to wade into the culture wars or to take a lead in any social engineering. By the way, I'm a father of 2 girls, and so there's nobody that's going to outbid me on the limitless potential of young women in American life. But that's not what this is about. This is about the Secretary of Defense reporting back to us after consulting with the generals and telling us one of 3 things. I think it's a pretty simple question. We should have the SecDef come back before the Congress in 6 months and say one of 3 things. Either A, the all-volunteer force that we're actually using in our forces right now are sufficient and they think the draft is obsolete, in which case the sunset would just go into effect. Or B, they would tell us that after consideration, they believe the draft is still necessary and some version of the present draft should be continued. Or C, they actually think that we have a deficit of human capital to potentially draft, and they think we need an expansion of the draft. And then this body could debate, who do we expand it to? But let's first have the Secretary of Defense consult the generals, come back to us in 6 months and say, A, all volunteer force works. B, we have about the right amount of human capital registered for the draft. Or C, we think we need to expand the draft. And maybe we'll say we should have men that are older than 26 years added to the draft. Maybe we should add women. Maybe there'll be some other configuration of people we would add to the draft. But until we know that we need more people in the draft or that we need a draft at all, why would we dive headlong right into what will be the most controversial version of this debate? Again, the generals are probably going to tell us they're fine with an all-volunteer force, but we don't know that. So why don't we have them report back before we start bickering? One of the fundamental purposes of this body is to debate the biggest issues facing the nation and to do so in an honorable way. That's what the Senate is for. The reason we have a Senate is to debate, not abstractions, but to address and ultimately solve the meatiest challenges that the Constitution and present circumstances demand that we tackle. Right now, women in the draft isn't really one of those issues. So I don't know why we would start fighting about it and dividing so many of the American people about it. If there's any senator that believes that the purpose of the NDAA should be to have a culture war fight, humbly, I would invite him or her to come to the floor and please make that case. If there's a reason we should have a culture war fight in the context of the NDAA, tell us why we should do it. But if not, let's avoid unnecessary cultural division and stick with the actual national security tasks that are before us today. Thank you, Mr. President.